Hello. Um, I hope this is a somewhat light-hearted video, really. And I've decided to title it My Non-Existent Magical Pedigree, um, uh, because it kind of describes me in some ways. Um, and I just wanted to sort of like meander and uh, talk a little bit about the kind of occultist I am and the kind of, well, practitioner I am, really, and where that comes from. And to do that, I'll just go into a bit of my background. I grew up in West London, and during the 1960s, which was my childhood, and the 70s, which was my adolescence, basically. And that shaped a lot of things about me, really, because what happened during that time, well, for a start, it's a time when there was lots and lots of books about occultism and lots of magazines which actually kind of sometimes touched on these things like man, myth, and magic and stuff like that. But there was lots of books about occultism, and we had sort of, you know, authors like Dennis Wheatley were massively popular, and you'd see their books in W.H. Smith's and everything. So there was a lot of the occult revival was going on. Various kind of entertainers, rock musicians, what have you, had an interest in people like Aleister Crowley or esotericism, and the kind of the hippie counterculture and the after effects of it were still swirling about. So we had a lot of that stuff all happening. So uh, that's the sort of thing that was happening, really. Um, there were sort of like also fantastic children's authors like Alan Garner that had really very magical streams within his work. And we had, TV plays popping up like um, like Penda's Fen and things like that, which I thought were just brilliant. Um, and you had this sort of like this soup of spiritual search and sexual liberation, and there was the drug culture going on in the background as well, somewhere, which, I mean, not that that was particularly impressive. Um, and so it was colored in that way. There was a lot of this sort of mm, exoticism, I suppose you'd say. And then in the middle of that, you had people like Alex and Maxine Sanders putting out their kind of their transmission basically directly into the media, about witchcraft. Um, Coffee table books started to appear in W.H. Smith's on magic and witchcraft and things like this. Uh, I was lucky in that in Hammersmith we had a really good local library, and they had a really fascinating occult section. In those days, you didn't have mind, body, spirit stuff, which is so sanitized nowadays. You had actual occult sections, both in bookshops and in libraries. And I mean, from the age of 11 onwards, I was down that library getting books out on all sorts of stuff and just like kind of like absorbing them. So all of this was happening. Uh, we were interested, me and my friends were all interested in things like tarot cards. Um, I got my first set of tarot cards when I was 15. Yeah. I got my first book on the practice of magic when I was 15 as well, which was David Conway's Magic and Occult Primer. Um, and I started studying astrology when I was 14. Um, but you see, that's the sort of stuff we had going. Yeah. Um, and those interests continued. Yeah. Basically, I fell in love with the occult or had it enter my life when I was really about 11, essentially, which is obviously too young to really kind of like know what you're talking about. But it was a very visceral thing which kind of like came into my life. And the thing with the occult is that once you do enter that world or a part of it, or you're kind of like bitten by the bug, it never leaves you, essentially. And so it's shaped a great deal of my life in that way. Now, I mean, I found Kenneth Grant's books a little bit later on. I also read The Great Beast, with that book, which was I found really, really inspiring at the time. Even though it's not entirely sympathetic to Crowley, I found it kind of inspiring. Um, and Kenneth Grant's books were just an epiphany, and that would have been when I was in my 20s, really. Um, but I mean, my life hasn't been particularly stable in many places. Yeah. It in certain places it hasn't been stable. Yeah. And so the 80s was a really, really weird time for me. I went through all sorts of things and pretty much went off the rails, kind of like at one point. Um, and then got back for in time for the 90s essentially. But I did make contact with certain people, towards the end of the 80s, which I'm still friends with, and, and that was a fruitful time. One thing that did happen in the 80s, which I remember, was that chaos magic appeared. And chaos magic, I think I first got Libanel in about 1980 when it was a small red edition, very slim, and it was just like this red edition printed out in a quite amateurish way. Um, and I remember reading that because I was an enormous Austin Osman Spare fan. Austin Osman Spare was just kind of everything, really, as far as I was concerned. Um, and I still really love that sense of the magical and the artistic combining because that's what I wanted, really. I wanted magic, art, life, one thing, you know. Um, but chaos magic, at the time, I really appreciated it. It really did it kind of gave you something. Chaos magic was a bit like punk in a way. It wasn't a just as punk wasn't actually a specific musical form. It was an upsurge of a particular kind of creative energy, which broke rules and or went off and did things in new ways, or went looking for new ways of doing things. Yeah, and had a particularly very, very individual, a very individual kind of Uranian orientation towards things. Chaos magic was almost like the magical equivalent of punk in that way. Um, what was impressive about it wasn't the forms; it was the spirit, basically, and that spirit's kind of like really stays with me. You could tell this is something made by people who loved Crowley and Kenneth Grant and these sorts of things. Yeah, um, and one of the some of the gems that I found at that time, just before I found actual supposed chaos magic called chaos magic, was stuff by Ramsey Jukes, who was also went by the name of Lionel Snell, and he did SSOTBME, and also a delightful book called Thundersqueak, which I compare almost in my memory. I almost compare it to an occult version of Withnell and I. It's very funny, very cheeky, as much of Ramsey's work at that time was. Um, and it was really wonderful. Those were fantastic. They really have the spirit of chaos magic, and you can really see how it's coming out of Crowley and coming out of the likes of Kenneth Grant and Austin Osman Spare and people like that. Yeah, you can really see that. So I think chaos magic was a like this particular upsurge which occurred very much like punk did, and that was like our stuff in a way. That was really our stuff. But I would always emphasize. It's the spirit of it, not the form. Because when I look back on the form, quite often it seems quite reductive and everything. Yeah. So that's what I would say about that. Uh, um, yeah, yeah. But that's kind of like what sort of like what formed me. Um, and I found also, really important stuff in people like Michael Bertio. Uh, I absolutely love Michael Bertio, and I think his work is tremendous. I think he's a lovely, lovely man as well. So he also was very, very important to me. But anyway, this is just a kind of like a sort of like a brief ramble about what formed me in a sense. Yeah. Um, and it kind of like it all comes in this kind of like this area. Honourable mention here to Mr. Mog Morgan, otherwise known as Keiton Shawal, who who published New ISIS magazine in the late 80s. Well, I found it in the late 80s, and I loved that magazine. And some of his articles there went on to into his book Sexual Magic, which is a great book, really fantastic as far as I was concerned. First book that I saw really going into a validation of homosexuality in magic, which I could relate to as well, because there was heart to the book. It wasn't just like cold techniques or what have you. So I was very, very happy with that, and so I would like to mention that as well. Um, there's been all sorts of things since then, but those are a lot of the formative influences for me. Yeah, and you'll see a lot of them are cultural, and they are spontaneous, and they come into your life, and you find them in yourself, and you find yourself in them. Yeah. So that's how magic has been for me. That's how the occult has been for me. Yeah. And so that's why I say what I do about this. Um, you know, uh, my non existent occult pedigree, because it's not really a pedigree, it's more of a massive happening that occurred, really, and continues to occur. I'm sure it does. Yeah. People find these things in all sorts of ways. They really do. Um, and so it's a kind of non-pedigree pedigree, if you see what I mean. Yeah, because uh, it comes out of the time when experienced, and everyone has a time to experience, and the occult is always there for those that really love it and want it. Yeah, uh, but I would say go for the old stuff is pretty good. The old stuff is good. I think the internet is pretty hopeless, to be truthful. I think the internet has done an awful lot of damage in many ways, even though it's obviously got a function in terms of communication and getting in touch with people. But it's very basic. It's very simple. So books are still the thing, really, in terms of that way. Uh, yeah, that's about it, really. Bit of a ramble. And I hope you're all doing really well, and speak to you soon. Bye.